Well, first of all, thank you to IDC. I haven't had the opportunity to say that. It's fantastic to be here, to meet so many people from so many diverse backgrounds. But I also want to say, pay a special tribute to all the helpers, to all the students who really made this a fantastic place. So give them a hand. Really. The next generation will have to handle all of this. We're passing it on to them, I guess. Are we prepared was the title of this. I will take a European perspective. It's a complex, many moving parts to this issue. When it comes to FTF returnees, it's a security issue. And I have to take issue maybe a little bit, but maybe this is such a, with Brian, a little bit with, because it's such a national issue for us. I always remind our ultimate decision makers back in Stockholm that there were 2 FTFs from Sweden who participated directly in the attack against targets in Paris and Brussels. In fact, there's a trial ongoing or starting with one of the Swedes, actually he comes from Malmö. It is also a very complex legal and judicial issue in individual countries, but also in other, in whether we're going to have international tribunal, a hybrid court. There are lots of different ideas that are being floated around. It's also ultimately a political issue, and I see in many of the European capitals they are sort of in a holding pattern. They are circling the runway, and really no one really wants to flinch. One exception is, of course, Kosovo, and I was down in the Balkans with the EU talking to the coordinators, and they've had a very successful, I guess, reintegration program. So it's an interesting sort of example. It's also a moral issue, right? So it's a moral issue about kids who have been born into the caliphate, or young children, and the children have rights internationally. I'm not going to go into that, but they certainly have rights. And there have been, in terms of the returnee issue, and there has been kids also sort of being brought back. It's also a geopolitical issue tied to the judicial issue. Now, is there going to be a court in Rojava, or is it going to be, these judicial dimensions also have a geopolitical dimension, etc. to that. Let me say that I'm a bit surprised that the international community is blindsided by this issue. I can say the EU certainly wasn't. The first, I work as part of, not being part of the National Defense University, I also work for the EU Radicalization Awareness Network since 2011. In 2012, 2013, we had our first workshop on FTFs going. We were seeing them going in 2012, 2013. In 2015, the EU started thinking about they're going to come back. So what do we do with that? And in 2017, we did a manual on behalf of the EU who commissioned us to say, look, think through every step of the way. What do we need to do? All right? What do we need to do from they come from they're out there? We didn't imagine that they would be perhaps in a refugee camp, but perhaps coming into Turkey. So there is a lot of advice out there what to do. I want to just jump very quickly with some numbers and so forth. But let me just start with one issue, which I think is really important. We speak to the security intelligence services in the West, and they are fully aware of this issue. But they always say one thing to us, and that is don't stare yourself blind just on the foreign fighter terrorism issue. It's not just the ones who are down there. They come back to something, and they come back to what I call the Salafi ecosystem. And here I think Europe has a real issue and a problem. I would actually even say that the environment back home is even more dangerous. We have about 1,500 who are going to be released from prisons, almost 500 in France, in the next few years. And that re-radicalizes and creates dynamic in these environments. They also don't just come back from the Middle East. And we, for example, in Sweden, have had Uzbeks or frustrated travelers who have been failed asylum seekers. And this is particularly for Germany and Sweden, a real difficult issue because some of them, in desperation sometimes, they undertake operations or they try to latch on to the conflict. It's also an issue of doing or having enough intelligence and helicopter perspective about what I would call the microfinancing of this system. 2 days ago, I knew the story was coming, but Danish FTFs, they only had 150 going, have been responsible for VAT fraud of 80 million euros just in that country. Looking at the microfinancing issue, absolutely essential, because then you see the trail of destruction and havoc, financial havoc that they have left behind, but it also gives you the contours of who the FTFs are connected to. So I just want to say that. And the enormity of this, of those who are still in the EU and who are regarded as national security threat, I guess was alluded to in the plenary sessions in the conference. I mean, just 3 member states have 60,000 individuals on their national security radar, and that's only a couple of sort of countries. So the scale is enormous. I come from the Nordic region. We have had about 600 FTFs. In my country, 300 who have traveled, one of the higher numbers in the EU. There are also really sort of interesting dimensions in relation to some facts and figures of those traveling from the EU that I think are interesting. Of the 300, we've already had 150 who've come back. So we had many people who've come back from the conflict theater. Most left in 2013 up until 2014. Few left in 2015. So the traveling was really stopping or really taking a drop quite early on. What we're also seeing in Europe is for those who left, is different profiles. If you talk, anyone here from France? No one from France? Then I can say, I was going to say I can say anything then. Yeah. Oh, sorry. You talk about who left from France, FTFs, you usually talk about second or third generation, right? They were all born and they're grown up. If you look at Germany, it's 61%. And if you look at my country, Sweden, even worse in Norway, it's 34% who were born, born in the country. In other words, in the northern Nordic countries, people have sought asylum, they are there for a while, and then they leave. So there's something about detachment in society. Integration is not working. And that is also a dimension that one has to work with. We have also the gender dimension. I'm not going to say too much because I know that you're going to talk about that. On average, there were 80% men who left, 20% women. Sweden had the highest, actually, very popular in going down to the conflict zone. We had 24% who left for the conflict zone. Average age, 26. Few women from the south of Europe, about 10%. And women radicalize faster. They also have different radicalization in different social spheres. And of course, I think it was in Germany that around 50% left with their family members. So you also had entire families who've gone down there. You have also geographical hotspots. So we have the Belgian commissioner. So this issue is geographically contained because of effective recruitment individuals. In Germany, You had FTFs, 1,000 of them, but I guess the sample was about 800 when this study was done by the services. They came from 162 German cities, but there were only 13 cities with more than 10 FTFs. In Sweden, 80% come from 4 cities, right? And this has to do with both the segregation, but also very effective recruitment routes or recruiters within those environments. Prison is going to be a source of radicalization. And I have to say, from a European perspective, I'm surprised that we haven't gotten any further. If I were going to give a suggestion of a panel next year for ICT, would be reintegration, resocialization. You have vast experience in Israel when it comes to profiling, risk management. How do you determine when someone is not sort of dangerous anymore? So I hope that the organizers listens to me about that. Lots of people with criminality in terms of the background. And you also have the issue of dual nationality. And this has been great advantage for some governments. Because I say, look, you know, first of all, I know my own government said, look, they are not coming back. In fact, we are revoking their asylum applications because there was a category of people who did not have citizenship. So you also have the issue of dual nationals. But I think one of the issues and one of the great challenges is this. And there we only have really Germany to thank for really having thought through the 1,000 that left from Germany. They looked at the ones who had returned. I think it was a sample of about 250, 300 who had returned by the time they did this study. And I thought a lot about that because 25% of the returnees would come back and 22% of the parents were cooperating with authorities, right? 50% go back to radical milieus and radical environments. Therefore, when we think about returnees, we should not think through a straw. We should take a much wider grip on the Salafi, using repressive means and using prevention. Because in Europe, unlike the United States, they are not going to be put away for a long time. They're going to come out at some stage. We also have to understand that, yes, there are going to be lots of different psychological challenges for these individuals. They are desensitized to violence. We've seen some cases in Sweden where people have committed violence against particular groups using over-violence, right? They have almost beheaded people. You have seen what it's like to be in a combat zone, and that has been transferred back into the violence that they have shown. They have post-traumatic stress disorder. They have humiliation, frustration, brutalization, trauma, and loss. And there are lots of different challenges when you're dealing with women, right? Deep commitment to the caliphate ideal for some. Peer pressure. Some of these women are visited by other women when they come back, unless they move from where they came from. Some people have an entire family who are radicalized. Only some of them have left. So you have to deal with that as well. Stigmatization within the community. I met a 16-year-old girl who gave birth, who were lured down. She was a convert. And the only thing I can think of, and the only thing she speaks about too, is that she gets bullied. She is under severe stress. She doesn't want to get back to her normal life. But she's going to pay for that mistake, I think, for a long time. Child protection issues. France, they prosecute everyone, men and women, and they take the kids into care. How do you care for these children? There are lots of different identity issues, child protection issues in relation to that. How do you prove parenthood? And that has also been very convenient for some governments in saying, look, there's no paperwork on this individual. it's going to take time. You may have to go to Kirkuk or somewhere to get DNA testing, etc. And of course, you have the children traumatization, etc. And you have to deal with all of that sort of issue. In terms of some challenges, and then we'll finish. Well, first of all, many of the FTFs either are still in theater, some are hiding in Turkey, some have relocated to other conflict zones. Sudan and Malaysia were two destinations that were lily pads. Sometimes there may be some individuals stayed in some of those theaters. There are very few disengagement programs. Prisons are not in the Nordic countries, but certainly in France and other countries, hotbeds for radicalization. If you were not radical before, you will really become radical afterwards. How do we deal with that? Connection to refugees and the issue of failed asylum seekers is another sort of issue. When it comes to risk assessment tools, there are lots of risk assessment tools around. I have yet to see really strong evidence that that there are actually ways we can improve them, right? So we need to think through risk assessment tools. And as Brian was saying, there are different legislative thresholds and prevention strategies in different countries. In many countries, you will get sentences, but they will be relatively low. It's important to get justice. Right-wing extremism is being fueled by not getting justice. And you have to, and this is something that we will have to live with, but I don't see the FTFs unless they come back. I think that there are mechanisms in which one can deal with them. I'm thinking now from a Nordic perspective. When I speak to people about, will you be able to handle these people coming back? They say, yes, we have a system. What we don't have is a disengagement de-radicalization program. And that is what we need to work with. But I always say to all the officials that if you don't work the whole space, if you don't lift yourself on a helicopter perspective, from a city perspective, working against the entire Salafi ecosystem, using really tough repressive measures, particularly tackling their financing, because the financing hurts. There's a lot of money in this within this sort of Salafi ecosystem. If you do that, then you will put the pressure on them, but it has to be complemented by working to try to reduce the space, not just on the individual level, but to reduce the space for most of the ones working in this environment, which includes FTFs. On that very depressive Swedish note, we are very depressive. That's why we had Ingmar Bergman and so on. But thank you.
Magnus was quite right in correcting me that in saying that there were no returnees. There have been, but this raises a broader question in terms of returnees carrying out violence after they came back. The Paris attacks, the Belgian attacks, that campaign that took place was really the result of a network that was recruited and created while the Islamic State was in existence by Abaoud, a kind of a terrorist entrepreneur who brought other people, in a sense, a level of recruitment after they arrived in Syria, to put them, to bring them back to then carry out attacks in the homeland, with at least the assistance of the Islamic State, less certain it was actually the operation was planned by the hierarchy of the Islamic State, and then Aboud was a lieutenant, or was he the entrepreneur in charge? That I'm not sure about that. But that was a deliberate campaign. When I said there were, we hadn't seen the foreign fighters sort of coming back and then coming back into terrorism, that's what I was meaning, but I should have clarified that. However, your use of the term, this ecology or ecosystem is quite correct, because what made that campaign so effective was not simply that these were returning veterans, in a sense. That was one half of it. It is the fact that they were able to plug into local Confederates who provided hideouts, logistical support, volunteers as well, and it was the combination of the returnees and the locals that made that so difficult to deal with. So it's an appropriate observation.
Yeah, I think it was certainly, in my mind, from what I've seen. I have pictures of some of the Swedes from being filmed by ISIS while they were training. Also, there are some very violent. But it is, you're absolutely right. It is that combination, and I think I think security services irregardless if you have had contact with ISIS, you are a national security risk for a significant period of time. Even children, if you're of a particular age. What I feel from, I mean, my position has been, when they ask me, media call me, politicians ask me, I say it's really a political issue if we want to have them back. But my advice had been, don't take them back, right? You have to sort out some legal construction. But I think it's really, I think politicians say they're going to lose votes from this if they don't have the laws, and some countries don't have the laws for this. But you're absolutely right that's why I say it's so important to focus in on the ecosystem and to know the hierarchies. And I have to say, Sweden now have arrested 6 imams or 4 imams. We have a special law. We can't try them, but we have 4 laws, and they see that they've established institutional platforms, schools and so on, these imams who have been sending people. But the problem is now we can only hold them for a particular period of time. We cannot expel them because of human rights dimensions.